A 29-year-old guy stands at checkout. His cart says $214. He doesn't call it a splurge. He calls it a need. Zillennials didn't stop wanting things. They stopped admitting they want things. Call this need inflation. It's the quiet move where a want gets relabeled a need, so it stops requiring justification. You don't defend a need. You just have it. Nobody asks you to explain why you bought groceries. So if a purchase gets filed under need, the internal debate ends before it starts. A woman renews a $16 skincare subscription she hasn't used in 6 weeks. She doesn't cancel it. Canceling would mean admitting it was optional. Need inflation isn't a discipline problem, and it isn't unique to one person's spending habits. It's now closer to a default setting. 55% of Gen Z say they're planning to splurge this year. 54% of millennials say the same. Almost identical numbers across 2 generations that supposedly grew up in different economies. When the split is that even, the explanation probably isn't personality. It's structural. Here's the mechanism, and this is the part worth sitting with. When the big, foundational needs go unstable, the small, optional ones start absorbing their urgency. Retirement is the clearest case. The average millennial has saved just under $50,000 toward retirement. They will need over $1 million to actually retire on. That gap doesn't produce discipline. It produces numbness. If a goal that far away is mathematically out of reach either way, the incentive to defer smaller purchases for its sake quietly collapses. Why protect a future that already looks unreachable? So spending stops being about planning and starts being about coping. Researchers have a name for this now: doom spending. Buying something you don't need, specifically to regulate a feeling you'd rather not sit with. It works because it's fast. A single tap resolves the discomfort of an unstable week in about 4 seconds. The relief is completely real. It's just borrowed from a future month that hasn't arrived yet. What makes Zillennials different from earlier generations isn't that they spend irrationally. It's that they know exactly what they're doing while they do it. A recent study found half of Gen Z shoppers sit with an item in their cart for 2 or more days before buying it. That's not impulse. That's deliberation. They agonize, they wait, they check their bank balance twice, and then they buy it anyway. Knowing a want is a want doesn't stop the need language from kicking in the moment they hit checkout. That gap between self-awareness and behavior is the actual pattern. It's not that people can't tell the difference between a want and a need anymore. It's that telling the difference stopped changing what they do next. There's a second layer to the cart-dwelling number worth noting. The same research found that most shoppers, across every generation, aren't even browsing with a specific item in mind. They're scrolling with loose, flexible intent, letting the algorithm hand them a want and waiting to see if it sticks. 2 days of deliberation isn't just self-control. It's also a search for evidence that the want deserves promotion. If it survives 48 hours of doubt, it graduates. It gets treated, from that point forward, like something the person always needed. Work absorbs the same pressure, just wearing a different outfit. 44% of millennials now run a side hustle, not for ambition, because the primary income was never built for this cost of living to begin with. A guy spends his Sunday evenings editing other people's resumes for cash. He tells himself it's for a cushion. The cushion has become the mattress. The side income stopped being extra a long time ago. Relationships get the same treatment, just with different vocabulary. Therapy language gave this generation real, useful tools. Boundaries, self-care, non-negotiables. It also gave need inflation a socially approved dialect. Calling something a boundary sounds healthier than calling it a preference, so preferences quietly get promoted too. A woman tells her friends she needs alone time every weekend, no exceptions. It might be true. It might also be a want wearing a boundaries clothing, since a want can be negotiated and a boundary, by definition, can't. Notice what's happening across all 4 of these: shopping, saving, working, relating. In every case, something optional quietly takes over the job that something essential used to do. The subscription becomes self-care. The side hustle becomes the actual floor under your income, not an extra layer above it. The boundary becomes armor against explaining a preference out loud. The splurge becomes the only form of control still available on a Tuesday. There's a simpler way to say all of this. Scarcity doesn't just change what people buy. It changes what people are willing to call things. When resources feel unpredictable, decision-making narrows toward the present. Today's relief starts outweighing next month's stability, almost automatically, without anyone consciously choosing that trade. Need inflation is what that narrowing sounds like out loud. It's not a character flaw showing up in a generation's spending app. It's a scarcity response, dressed in the vocabulary of self-care. None of this is happening because a generation lost self-control. It's happening because the categories underneath got scrambled first, and the language followed. A need used to mean survival, food, shelter, stability, the ability to plan 5 years out with some confidence it'll hold. When shelter and long-term stability stopped being reachable through the normal channels people were told to trust. No realistic path to a house, no retirement math that actually closes. The brain doesn't just leave that need-shaped hole sitting empty. It fills it with whatever is close enough to reach right now. A candle, a subscription, a cart full of things labeled essential that nobody in 1995 would have called essential with a straight face. That's why the guilt shows up sideways instead of head-on. It's rarely "I spent too much." It's closer to "I don't know why I still feel behind, even after I bought the thing that was supposed to help." The purchase was quietly assigned the job of closing a much bigger gap. It never closes it, because the gap was never really about the purchase in the first place. It was about the missing floor underneath it. This is also why cutting back doesn't feel like relief, even when people actually manage to do it. 74% of Gen Z say they're ready to trim non-essential spending if their finances get worse. 82% of millennials say the same, an even higher number. But trimming a want that's been wearing a needs clothes for months doesn't register as discipline. It registers as a small loss, every single time, because the language never got corrected along the way. The item was never formally demoted back to optional. It just got quietly removed from the cart while still filed, internally, under necessary. There's a reason this particular confusion is so hard to catch from the inside. Need and want aren't separated by a bright line. They sit on a spectrum, and almost everyone crosses it without noticing, because the crossing doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like relief arriving right on schedule. Nobody sits down and consciously decides to inflate a want into a need. The relabeling happens upstream of conscious thought, in whatever part of the brain is responsible for making the week feel survivable. By the time the purchase reaches a bank statement, it's already been filed, and refiling it after the fact takes a kind of honesty most people don't have the bandwidth for at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. That's also why this pattern doesn't respond well to budgeting advice alone. A spreadsheet can track where the money went. It can't relabel what the money was doing emotionally at the moment it left the account. Telling someone to just stick to their needs assumes the categories are stable and obvious. For a generation whose actual structural needs, housing, retirement, a stable floor under their income, stopped being reliably reachable, the categories were never stable to begin with. The advice keeps failing because it's aimed at a problem this generation doesn't actually have. The problem was never poor math. It's a missing foundation, wearing a want's clothing so it can get purchased without anyone having to say the real thing out loud. Go back to the guy at checkout, $214. He's not weak, and he's not confused about basic arithmetic. He can do the math on his retirement number just as easily as anyone reporting it in a survey. He's using the only vocabulary that still gets him through the week intact, labeling relief as necessity, because admitting it's optional would mean admitting how much of his actual, structural needs are currently out of reach and staying that way. The purchase isn't really the problem here. It's the closest thing he has to a need he can actually satisfy on a random Tuesday when the bigger ones aren't answering. If any of this landed, there's more of this on the channel.